Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
An historic regret. That, according to Iran's President Hassan Rouhani, would be the consequence if America pulls out of the nuclear deal. But the Israeli President Benjamin Netanyahu deployed the exact same rhetoric used by Donald Trump, calling the 2015 agreement a horrible deal. It's that kind of international intransigence Boris Johnson is attempting to overcome in a series of meetings in Washington this week. If he fails, the US president looks set to scrap the agreement by Saturday. Paul McNamara has this report.
It's a horrible agreement.
A bad deal.
This is one of the worst deals. You look at how bad it is.
This incompetent deal. The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into.
During an arguably inconsistent presidency, there has at least been one issue with a consistent stance: the Iran nuclear deal. Now, with just 6 days left to stick to it, Britain's very own Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson is crossing the Atlantic to throw his diplomatic weight behind the deal. But while Mr. Johnson was mid-flight, the Iranian president took to state TV to warn what failure could mean.
If the US decides to pull out of the nuclear deal, it will soon realise that this decision will become an historic regret for them.
It was a landmark deal 12 years in the making, in which Iran agreed to limit its nuclear activities in return for easing of economic sanctions.
Because of this deal, the international community will be able to verify that the Islamic Republic of Iran will not develop a nuclear weapon.
His successor disagrees, though, and always has done. In a call with Theresa May yesterday, the president, quote, underscored his commitment to ensure that Iran never acquires a nuclear weapon. Hours later, Boris Johnson was on a flight. Before boarding the plane to Washington, the Foreign Secretary released a statement dripping with diplomacy, but without any specific mention of the Iran deal.
On so many of the world's foreign policy challenges, the UK and US are in lockstep.
Adding,
the UK, US and European partners are also united in our effort to tackle the kind of Iranian behaviour that makes the Middle East region less secure. Its cyber activities, its support for groups like Hezbollah, and its dangerous missile programme, which is arming Houthi militias in Yemen.
He follows where others have tread before, most recently by the French president. Convincing Mr. Trump to stick by the deal was one of Emmanuel Macron's stated goals for his state visit 2 weeks ago. There are lobbyists on both sides of this deal, though. Today, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told reporters it, quote, has to be either fully fixed or fully nixed. Otherwise, he warned, you will end up with an Iran with a nuclear arsenal in a very short time. These two leaders are much more aligned on this point than previously known, according to allegations in today's Observer. Days after this visit to Tel Aviv a year ago, the newspaper claims aides to Donald Trump hired an Israeli private intelligence agency to undermine the deal. Their aim, allegedly, to orchestrate a campaign against key individuals from the Obama administration who helped negotiate the Iran peace deal. The White House refused to comment on the claims. True or not, Boris Johnson's task is to convince a president and billionaire businessman to sign a deal he says he despises.
Paul McNamara reporting there.
The Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson has appealed to Donald Trump not to throw the baby out with the bathwater by abandoning the Iran nuclear deal. On a trip to Washington, Mr. Johnson appeared on President Trump's favourite morning TV show, Fox and Friends, to say the 2015 accord was not perfect but could be fixed. Mr. Trump, who's called the agreement insane, is to decide whether or not to stick with it by the end of the week. Nick Bryant reports.
On American television this morning, a double serving of Boris at breakfast. The Foreign Secretary appearing on Donald Trump's favourite news show, Fox and Friends, to address an audience of one.
We think that what you can do is be tougher on Iran, address the concerns of the president, and not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
And just in case the president had switched channels, he popped up on a rival network as well.
I understand that people have anxieties about this deal, and of course they're right in the sense that it is very far from perfect, but it is the best thing that we have at the moment.
Donald Trump has called the Iran deal negotiated by the Obama administration a disaster and seems likely to pull America out of it at the end of the week. And although the Foreign Secretary isn't scheduled to shake hands with the US President, that hasn't stopped him stroking his ego.
If he can fix North Korea, and if he can fix the Iran nuclear deal, then I don't see why he's any less of a candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize than Barack Obama, who got it before he even did anything.
Long live the United States. Long live France.
He's not the first European to compliment, charm and cajole. The French President Emmanuel Macron last month pleading with Mr. Trump not to blow up the deal. And the German Chancellor Angela Merkel made the same case just a few days later. So from Boris Johnson, a final face-to-face plea to senior administration officials such as the new Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. But he's taken a tough stance on Iran and said the landmark deal is built on lies. The European countries haven't yet admitted defeat, but the word from Paris tonight is that France, Germany and Britain would stick to the Iran deal regardless of what Donald Trump decides. The problem is that the reimposition of US sanctions on Tehran could deal it a fatal blow. Nick Bryant, BBC News, Washington.
President Trump has tweeted he will reveal whether he will pull the US out of the Iran nuclear deal tomorrow. The Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, has been in Washington trying to influence that decision and today appeared on the president's favourite news programme to argue for keeping the deal intact. Our political correspondent Romilly Weeks is here to discuss this. Romilly, is that likely to have worked?
Well, it won't be easy, certainly. The president's view is pretty entrenched. He's called the Iran nuclear deal insane, the worst deal ever. The German Chancellor, the French President and now Boris Johnson have all gone to Washington to try and persuade him to think again. The other two got face-to-face meetings with the president. Boris Johnson, as you say, took this rather unusual step of appearing on Fox and Friends, a show that the president is known to watch obsessively, and this is what he had to say.
The president has a legitimate point. He set a challenge for the world. We think that what you can do is be tougher on Iran, address the concerns of the president, and not throw the baby out with the bathwater, not junk a deal. Because, as I say, Plan B does not seem to me to be particularly well developed at this stage.
You'll notice how careful Boris Johnson was with his language there, going out of his way to acknowledge President Trump's concerns that the deal is flawed, whilst trying to maintain, to influence him at the same time that this is the only show in town, that this is the only way available to stop Iran developing nuclear weapons.
Has there been any response from the Iranians about this?
Yes, the Iranian president has said that America will be the big loser if they pull out, but he has also suggested that even if America does leave, that the deal could still go ahead, but it will certainly put pressure on what is already a pretty fragile pact. Boris Johnson said before he left Washington that President Trump could be in line, should be considered for a Nobel Peace Prize if he pulls back from the brink on Iran and if he sorts out North Korea. Whether the president is listening, we'll find out within the next 24 hours.
OK, Romilly, thank you very much.
Well, Boris Johnson has asked President Trump not to throw the baby out with the bathwater by rejecting the Iran nuclear agreement. He's on a trip to Washington with the goal of keeping the US in the deal as it comes up for recertification. The president has in the past described the international pact, which dates from the Obama era, as insane. Mr. Johnson is not meeting President Trump himself, who's expected to make a final decision this week, but he's done the closest thing, appearing on the president's favourite breakfast show, Fox and Friends. Our Washington correspondent Kylie Morris reports.
Here to explain, British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson. Mr. Secretary?
Turn on Fox and Friends this morning, and there he was, the Foreign Secretary playing defence for the deal with Iran Donald Trump calls horrible. His pitch? Yes, it's flawed, but it's better than nothing.
Yes, the president has a legitimate point. He set a challenge for the world. We think that what you can do is be tougher on Iran, address the concerns of the president, and not throw the baby out with the bathwater, not junk a deal. Because, as I say, Plan B does not seem to me to be particularly well developed at this stage.
Gotcha, Mr. Secretary.
And it was a thumbs up to the world, and particularly to any president who might be watching.
That John Kerry, if he wants to influence things, he ought to talk to the leader of the free world, Donald Trump.
There's every indication Donald Trump was watching the network a little later, as Fox criticised the former Secretary of State John Kerry, who negotiated the deal. The president weighed in by tweet. The United States does not need John Kerry's possibly illegal shadow diplomacy on the very badly negotiated Iran deal. He was the one that created this mess in the first place. While the Foreign Secretary did not meet the President, he did meet Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, presumably to flesh out what some broader deal might look like. But neither was answering questions as they stood for the cameras in the lavishly decorated treaty room.
Are you persuaded, sir? Are you persuaded, Secretary Pompeo?
This is now very much a treaty at risk. Agreed in 2015, it eased sanctions on Tehran in exchange for limiting its nuclear ambitions. The deal struck between Iran and the US, UK, France, Russia, China and Germany, venerated as President Obama's greatest foreign policy achievement. The French and German foreign ministers today both argued the urgent need for its preservation. Germany warns without it the world would be less safe. And France says it will maintain it independently of the American decision. Today, from the Iranian president, an indication that Tehran might be willing to persevere too, regardless of what Washington decides.
What we want for the deal is that it's preserved and guaranteed by the non-Americans, and then the US pullout will be okay. We will get rid of the mischievous element that always caused trouble. And if what we want is not fulfilled, we have our own legal and lawful path and have our own plans.
To pacify the mischievous element, presumably the US, the Foreign Secretary has made the argument that Iran's conventional weapons program and its regional ambitions can be curtailed without jettisoning the deal. And he's deployed some weapons-grade flattery while he's here to turn the president's head. On North Korea, if not Iran, it seems President Trump might just deserve a Nobel Peace Prize.
If he can fix North Korea, and if he can fix the Iran nuclear deal, then I don't see why he's any less of a candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize than Barack Obama, who got it before he even did anything.
I'm joined now by Trita Parsi, president of the National Iranian-American Council and author of Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy. If Donald Trump does refuse to recertify the deal, is there a better deal on offer? I mean, that's what Boris Johnson seems to be suggesting, that, you know, there might be something stronger from the American point of view that might be achievable.
I'm sure there are things that are stronger from the American perspective that Trump would like to achieve, but liking to achieve it and being achievable is two completely different things, because to be achievable, it also means that the Iranians need to agree to it. And mindful of the way that Trump has conducted himself, the prospects of getting not only the other countries of the P5+1 back to the negotiating table, but also the Iranians, is essentially minimal, because so far the United States itself has actually not honored the deal. Donald Trump has been violating this deal for a year and a half. So this gives the Iranians very little incentive to think that they can actually get a deal with Donald Trump that would be better than the one that already exists, mindful of the fact that Donald Trump is not even honoring the existing one.
Well, do you think if he effectively pulls out of it, the deal as is could sort of stumble on with the Europeans, Russia and China sort of continuing to back it? Well, you know, would the Iranians want that?
If Europe really steps up and tries to essentially fill the gap and ensure that the Iranians are getting the financial and economic incentives that they were promised when they signed the deal, then it could work. But that requires that Europe actually starts talking to the Iranians and trying to beef up their relationship there to make sure that they can fill in for the US. So far, most of the European diplomacy has been here in Washington, in which they've been trying to appease Donald Trump. And there are no indications that Donald Trump really is appeasable.
And so, I mean, if none of that happens, what are you saying is likely in Iran? I mean, will they effectively start up their program again?
Well, if the United States pulls out of the deal, the Europeans more or less caves to the American pressure, and European companies start getting out of the Iranian market, then there's really no good reason to believe that the Iranians wouldn't restart their program. And then we will quickly be in a scenario worse than the one that existed in 2012, in which the Iranians were expanding their program. The U.S. was inching closer to a military intervention. But the difference is that in 2012, at least there was a diplomatic option that had not been exhausted, and there was political willingness to pursue it. In 2018, thanks to Donald Trump, there will be no diplomatic option, and there certainly doesn't seem to be much political will to pursue it anyways.
Well, I mean,
that's a much more dangerous situation.
Around all of this, of course, we also see Israel's role here, sort of making the case that Iran's been breaking the rules, you know, mounting airstrikes in Syria, believed to be sort of targeting Iranian positions in Syria. I mean, there's a story about you and other sort of people in the press this weekend as well about how, you know, you've been sort of drawn into an attempt to discredit the Obama administration who won this deal in the first place. Can you just explain what happened to you?
What happened to me was someone contacted me and pretending to be a journalist and was trying to get me to say that the Obama administration had a financial interest in striking the nuclear deal, which, according to my research, there was no basis for. I pushed back pretty hard against that line because I see no basis for it. And it's not until this past weekend that I found out that this actually was not a journalist, but someone who was working for this Israeli intelligence firm that apparently had been hired by the Trump administration to discredit the nuclear deal and the people involved in getting the nuclear deal. And I think that tells us something about how desperate the effort is to kill this deal in order to pave the way for a broader military confrontation with Iran.
You think that's what's going to happen to you? I mean, war, effectively.
It certainly is what some people are shooting for by doing the things that they're doing right now. And I think in the absence of proper diplomacy, we should not take this lightly, because the region, as you mentioned, is already on the brink of war. And if you add this to the mix, it certainly doesn't make the picture look any better.
Teresa Party, thank you very much indeed.